Okay, now that we've spent some time on subjects and action verbs, we're going to move on to our next unit, adverbs. Now we've talked about adjectives, which are words that modify nouns. An adverb is an all-purpose modifier. It can modify a verb, an adjective, or even another adverb. So we're going to talk about those things separately. Let's first talk about its main job, which is modifying verbs. So when an adverb modifies a verb, it can tell you how, when, where, or why about that verb. So in our example, the students arrived promptly today. Promptly tells you how they arrived. It's an adverb, so we'll mark it ADV. What about today? Now, you might on the outset think that's a noun, as if it's some sort of thing. But is it really? It's actually an adverb because it's telling you when they arrived. So there's an example of what the diagram looks like. Diagonal lines connected to the main word that's modified. Really no different than how an adjective would be diagrammed underneath a noun. Now here's something kind of cool. Adverbs that modify verbs are movable within the sentence. This is really, really important. It's going to be really helpful later on. In the English language, usually words come in a certain order and in a certain way, and if you move them around, it completely changes the meaning of the sentence. However, adverbs are one, when they modify verbs, that don't work that way. So you could say, today the students arrived promptly, or the students promptly arrived today, or the students arrived today promptly. You see how you can move them around and it doesn't change. Everything means the same. And that's one of your indications that that word that you can move around the sentence is one that modifies the verb. And a word that modifies a verb is an adverb. So let's talk about adverbs that modify adjectives. These words will tell you how or to what extent about adjectives. So this sentence, the extremely nervous patient sat in the dentist's chair. Patient is our noun, and we would say which patient? Well, the extremely nervous patient. Nervous certainly describes the patient. However, extremely doesn't describe the patient. Extremely modifies nervous. It tells us how nervous the patient was. So that's how you know that instead of modifying the noun, that word modifies the adjective. And in that case, it's going to be marked ADV, and it's an adverb. It's telling us how or to what extent that adjective is. Now, many of those type of adverbs end in ly. So it's one of the little tricks you can use. If you ever see words that end in ly that describe something, that's an indication to you that it might be an adverb modifying an adjective. Here's an example of what a diagram would look like. Now, we call this construction a dog's hind leg. We needed a way to connect extremely to nervous, and nervous is already on a diagonal line. So you make a little dog leg out and then back down on a diagonal. And that allows you to connect extremely to nervous to show that extremely modifies nervous. Now, adverbs that modify other adverbs will also tell you how or to what extent about adverbs. Here's an example. Our guest left quite abruptly. Well, what does quite tell you? It tells you how abruptly. So it's an adverb. Now, it can't be moved away from the word abruptly, right? Even though the whole phrase quite abruptly can be moved. Quite abruptly, our guest left. So that tells you that quite needs to be stuck to abruptly. And here's how you would diagram that. Whenever you have a modifier modifying another modifier, that's when you'll use a dog's hind leg. Now let's talk about prepositional phrases. Now we've learned about prepositional phrases and you know how to identify them in the sentence, and that's not going to change. However, Prepositional phrases can modify nouns and therefore are adjectival, which means they act like adjectives, but they can also modify other things in the sentence, like verbs or adjectives or even adverbs. And in that case, they are adverbial, or acting like an adverb. When a prepositional phrase modifies a verb or another modifier, they will answer the same type of questions that an adverb would. Here are a few examples of how to diagram those. We ate lunch in the park. Well, in the park tells you where we ate lunch. And so you would diagram it off the verb. Now remember, we can move things that modify the verb. So you can say, in the park we ate lunch, and that works. How about, I saw him later in the day? So this one can be a little tricky. Follow me here. The baseline is I saw. Now we have another word here, him, which is something else that we haven't gotten to yet, but we don't need it for me to show you what's going on with the prepositional phrase. Later modifies the verb saw. It tells us when, right? In the day, though, tells us to what extent later, right? So in a weird little combination of a dog's hind leg and a prepositional phrase, we're going to connect in the day to later. Let's go back to our movable test. Now we can move later in the day to a different part of the sentence and just say later in the day, I saw him, right? But we can't say I saw him later and take in the day and move it elsewhere. In the day, I saw him later sounds really weird. Later in the day need to be stuck together, which means that in the day modifies later. Let's talk about a few handy little notes. Now I will say that prepositional phrase placement is probably one of the more difficult basic grammar concepts there is when it comes to diagramming. There are a few tips and tricks that I'm going to teach you to make it easier, but grammar really does come down to analysis, and this is where a lot of that analyzing takes place. One little trick, and I did mention it earlier, is that many adverbs end in ly. So if you see that ly, that should indicate to you you might have an adverb. The words how, when, where, and why can be adverbs, so mark them that way for now. Not, never, really, and very are very commonly adverbs. They tell you how or to what extent. I like this one. If you just can't figure out what a word is, it's probably an adverb. And now that seems a little silly, but it's kind of true. When you're having a hard time figuring out what to do with a modifier, whether it's an adverb or a prepositional phrase, I'm going to give you a set of 3 tests that I want you to use. The first one is the questions. So if it answers which about an adjective, or how, when, where, or why about a verb, or how or to what extent about an adjective or another adverb, if it clearly answers one of those questions, boom, you've got your answer and you know what that adverb or that prepositional phrase is. But sometimes it's not quite clear, and so you have to move to your next test. The next test is that movability thing that I've mentioned a few times. Try to move it around. If you can move it around in the sentence without changing the meaning of the sentence, and that's important, then that's a pretty good indicator that it modifies the verb, and therefore is some sort of adverb or a prepositional phrase that modifies an adverb. If that one isn't conclusive, then you can use the last test, which I call the read 'em together test. This one is especially helpful for prepositional phrases. Prepositional phrases almost always come after, not before, after the word they modify. So usually you have 2 or maybe 3 words in the sentence that you think that prepositional phrase may modify. Read each word with the prepositional phrase right after it. The one that sounds the most natural is usually the correct answer. Let's try it. Let's go back to that sentence, I saw him later in the day. We could use I, or saw, or him, or later, right? So we're going to take each one of those and read the prepositional phrase right after it. I in the day, that doesn't sound right. Saw in the day, that doesn't sound right either. Him in the day, nope. Later in the day, that sort of flows, right? So that's another indication, especially if the other two tests don't work, that that's the word that the prepositional phrase should modify, and therefore that's the word the prepositional phrase should be diagrammed under. If there is anything when it comes to diagramming that can be debated, it's prepositional phrase placement. So when you do your diagram and then pull up our key and compare your diagram to ours, and you've placed your prepositional phrase in a different place than where we have, if you can honestly tell yourself why you chose to put the prepositional phrase there, give me a good analytical reason. For instance, well, I could move it to two different places in the sentence and it still made sense. Or, well, it told me when about the verb. Then I would accept it. If I were virtually there with you, I would give you the point. But if your reasoning is not analytical, for instance, if you put the prepositional phrase under a particular word simply because it came right after that word in the sentence, that's not acceptable. There are certainly times where it can be debated, and as long as you have a good, clear-cut, understandable reason for why you might differ from the key in that way, I'd go ahead and move along. But if it happens a lot, you probably got a problem. Okay? So, with this unit, you will be diagramming the sentence and you will be hanging modifiers underneath both the subject and the verb. And a lot more thought is going to have to go into where those prepositional phrases go in the diagram. Keep track of the process steps that we've given you so far, and make sure that you're using those 3 tests to really figure out what to do with the prepositional phrase, just in case. One last thing. You may have noticed in the previous unit that there were a few cases where you had a noun followed by 2 prepositional phrases. In that case, sometimes the 2 prepositional phrases were diagrammed in what I call a stair-step formation, where the second prepositional phrase is modifying the object of the first prepositional phrase. There were other times where you had 2 prepositional phrases that together were both diagrammed off the subject. Keep in mind that any noun, the subject or the object of the preposition, can be modified by adjectives, articles, and prepositional phrases. So when you go to diagram the sentence, you need to really pay attention to figure out whether the prepositional phrase is modifying the object of the preposition before it, or the noun, which in this case so far to you is the subject. Prepositional phrases can modify any nouns, so that's part of the analytical process you'll need to go to. Okay? Best of luck.